Well, thank you, Gunnar, and Thomas and Dale for the invitation to be a keynote speaker. What an honor. I'm like in a panic attack here. But I'm really happy to have this opportunity to tell you about a little bit about my research using experiments in the field to understand natural research users to really get to the micro and behavioral foundations of these activities. So I would like to, take you to a tour through the experiments that I've been doing over the past already 15 years. So I have some experience and show you about that. I have to move my computer and I have to move this because I don't have a screen to look at, so it's kind of confusing. Oh, this is not. See? Can you put back my... So which one should I move? This one? No. Yes. So this is basically the outline of the presentation. I would like to tell you about why decision-making experiments in the field. Probably all of you know about decision-making experiments, but I just want to have common language here. Then walk you through some of the lessons from field experiments that I have learned over the years. These are not necessarily all connected. I just want to show you a little bit about the questions that I'm trying to ask and how I've been doing this experiment. So I will show you something about fisherman behavior, some about water and irrigation systems, and talk about more recent work on small-scale gold mining and payment for ecosystem services. Most of this work has been published, although I'm also going to show you some of my ongoing work, and this is not by all means an individual research agenda. I've been doing this with a lot of collaborators over the years. Then I want to talk about a bit of it about how I've been using these experiments also as a pedagogical tool in the field. So the experimental subjects are not only subjects, are actually communities with a lot of needs. So we've been using these experiments as a pedagogical tool in the field. And finally, I would like to end with this basically invitation to the EFD network to maybe find a common protocol and interest to replicate across context. So just to start, as I said, probably everybody knows about this, but I just want to have a common language here. When I'm talking about decision-making experiments, I'm referring to this exercise in which individuals make decisions. Individual decision has monetary consequences, so they are not just getting paid for participating, but for their decisions. Payment depends on individual and group decisions, and the payments are, trying to cover the opportunity costs. So with the principle that people will reveal their preferences then. Of course, these experiments are not an exact representation of real life, but they are trying to capture a dilemma that is important for the research. I use what is called in the literature artifactual and frame field experiments, which are the same as the lab experiments conducted with the students, but in the field with people for whom the dilemma is relevant or with field context. As you can see in the pictures, in my case, the field is literal. I've been doing these experiments in the middle of the jungle, basically in Latin America, and as I will show you. So the idea to move from the lab with the students to the field is, in the search of external validity, but also the shortcomings for studying empirical alternatives for studying behavioral issues such as motivations and preferences. Those are difficult to study with different methodologies, but also the shortcomings for studying intervention consequences and policy designs. This is a difficult statement to make in the era of RCTs, but I will argue that lab experiments are still an important tool to study these intervention consequences. So, of course, as I said, to claim that decision-making experiments are an important tool to study interventions in the era of RCTs could be quite an statement, but they both, decision-making experiments and RCTs, share the principles of randomization. However, real interventions are not always possible or even desirable, especially when you are studying the consequences of unintended effects of some interventions. So I think that still decision-making experiment has a place there to study those behavioral issues that we are not aware of or theory cannot predict. you know, I'm a bit concerned of what spending so much money testing different designs in the interventions in the RCTs if you are not sure it works. I mean, I think that decision-making experiments could be part of this, you know, production system in which decision-making experiments are used as a test bed for RCTs, and this whole idea of test, learn, adapt, the decision-making experiments could be also there, so we don't just spend, you know, millions of dollars just changing little variations of the intervention. So I will argue that there is still a space for decision-making experiments to study intervention as a part of these RCTs or by itself. So now, you know, I would like to show you some of the work that I've been doing with these experiments over the years in Latin America. And just, you know, I'm not going to go through the details of all the experimental design. It's more like the questions that I have been asking over the years. So the first work that I did was together with John Stralon and Jim Murphy. And there we were really thinking about what motivates artisanal fishermen. And in that time, I wanted to be, and also most of my research wanted to be part of that conversation and debate in the social sciences between the self-interest leading to the tragedy of the commons and, you know, the capacity to self-organize. So I wanted to be part of this debate that I think is going on in the literature. So the first question here was, well, what motivates fishermen? And for that, we did these common pool resource games with fishermen in rural Colombia, in which participants had to decide how much to extract, how much fish to extract, depending on their individual decisions and decisions of the group. And participants made decisions using a payoff table. This payoff table that I will show you in a minute basically captures a dilemma between the individual and the group interest. So for those of you who are not familiar, the typical CPR games goes as follows, and is that people have to make decisions over this payoff table on group of fives, how much you extract, how much the others extract in the group. And if everybody extracts 2, basically that's the social optimum, but then you have the incentive to extract more, and if everybody extracts more, then you end up in the tragedy of the commons. In this case, this table is not a dominant strategy, so basically the Nash equilibrium is 7. So if you are just pursuing your self-interest, you will end up extracting 7. So basically in that initial paper, what we tried to do was to model and test what motives were driving individual behavior. So we modeled self-interest, altruism, reciprocity, conformity. I will not go over all the models. I just wanted to show you that what we found back then was that conformity best describes average motivation. That doesn't mean that everybody was conforming, but that on average, conformity was sort of explaining individual behavior. However, conformity didn't lead to the tragedy of the commons, but didn't lead to the social optimum. So still, institutions were needed to solve the dilemma. So in a following work, what we were asking there was, well, what happened when you introduce external regulation? That if you introduce external regulation, that crowd out a capacity to self-organize or not. And again, we did these experiments in Colombia in different communities, and we explored this interaction effect between external regulation and capacity to organize. And what we found is that there is no clear pattern. The results are community specific, and I think that was an important finding because I think this is a cautionary tale for field experiments in single study locations. I mean, you cannot claim general results when you are doing this in the field in a single community. So based on those results, and in a more recent work that we are doing now with Andreas Lembrand in Monash University and Sergio Puerto, a PhD student in Cornell, we were invited by the Environmental Defense Fund to think about creative to solve the problem of overfishing in Baja California. So in that area in Mexico, they have tried basically every single instrument, economic instrument in the textbook. They have ITQs, they have a marine reserve, they have bans, they have compensation mechanisms, but there's still a lot of overfishing and illegal fishing. So Environmental Defense Funds invited us to do experiments there and start to think about creative solutions to the overfishing and illegal fishing problem. So our methodological approach here was, okay, if there's a cautionary tale about single location studies, we have to really understand the context before designing the intervention. So first we did like pre-experimental surveys and fieldwork to understand the context. Based on those surveys, we sort of design and test different interventions in pilot experiments to see which intervention was actually working. Then we go through one of the interventions that was successful and start changing designs, thinking that that intervention could actually be tested in the field with an RCT. So in this study, we basically used the same experiment and payoff table that I showed you before, and fishermen basically participated in 10 rounds. The first were the baseline, 5 rounds of baseline, and then 5 rounds with treatment. And we explored different interventions. Venting against authority. When we did the surveys, we found out that people were not considering that the regulatory framework was legitimate because they didn't have a voice when that was designed. So there is a lot of literature showing that if people express their emotions, they are actually going to accept better the regulations. So we have this intervention in which people vent against the authority. That means they send messages to the environmental authority to see, I mean, it was open, they could write anything before each round instruction. Then we proved the signaling disapproval to peers using sad faces that has been used before in the literature. In the survey, we find out that the most sort of popular person in the area was the Catholic Pope, and that was at that time the time in which the Pope wrote the encyclica. So one of our interventions was to read pieces of the encyclica of the Pope in which we remind people the importance of taking care of the fishermen. I know that was a little bit, don't take me wrong, we did it very respectful, but it was funny that I was reading the encyclica each round so people may change behavior. And then the fourth, it was another intervention to looking for have some regrouping based on individual extraction. So we announced in period 5 that based on period extraction in period 6 and 7, we will rank fishermen according to the level of extraction, and the fishermen in the first 5 places, we will form the sustainable fishing group. The next fishermen, we will form the second group, and the following the third group. And they will play in those new groups the last round. Thinking that if the social norm in that community was actually to fish illegally, we have to sort of restart the social and reset a social norm. No? And we have to sort of highlight the sustainable fishing group. So very quickly, as you can see here, I just wanted to show you, graphically, none of the other, including my special Pope framing idea, didn't work. Nothing changed behavior, except the regrouping of sustainable fishing group. But we thought, then we can work out in that particular intervention, but that's a very strict intervention that in real life would be difficult to rank everybody and regroup. So we start thinking about how can we change this intervention with information asymmetries or noises, so in real life could be feasible. So then we try, it's this one. Then we try sort of different treatments in which we have the complete ranking as I show you, then some noise in the ranking, then only showing the ranking of the sustainable fishing group, then increasing probability of monitoring if you were in this sustainable fishing group, etc. And basically what we found is that all the treatments are effective even when they are informational asymmetries of regrouping imperfection. So, the idea of in the next round of experiment is to really implement this as a real intervention. The treatment effect is greater in the ranking period than in the regrouping period. And something that is more important here, we found that the regrouping effect is stronger in the sustainable fishing group, but it also has effect in the other groups. So those who were ranked last and were formed the third group were also reducing the level of extraction. So it's a good thing. When we created this new norm and highlighted those who were complying with the norm, the other groups are also reducing level of extraction. So that's for fisheries. Let me shift gears here to other work that we are doing about water allocation and thinking about bargaining and water allocation. This is a little bit more conceptual than the one that I just showed you, because here we were thinking about distributional issues. And here is a work with Alex Paff and others. Basically, the question that we were asking was how unequal information about resource quantity affects bargaining, and how banding contract versus trust-based institutions affect both efficiency and equity. And we were asking this question because we were studying this problem in Brazil, in Ceará, in which they have these participatory water allocation committees in which they have to distribute water between rural and urban area. And of course, urban area is more productive than the rural area because they use water for tourism, etc. So in the context of that problem, we wanted to see what is the effect of asymmetries in information and the effect of different types of institutions in the water allocation. So as I said, this is a more conceptual work, and how we model this, the idea of how unequal information affects bargaining. We use the ultimatum game, the classical ultimatum game, but in this case, we change it in the information that both parties has. So now, in this case, we design that proposer knows the quantity, either high or low, and makes an offer to divide the resource, and the responders only knows a forecast, thinking that in real life there are, information asymmetries, for example, between urban and rural area. And our result here is very clean and very, very straightforward. Basically, what we found is that with symmetric information, that is the classical ultimatum game, people distribute the water or the resource 60-40, which is what is found in the literature. However, when there is informational asymmetries, that is, the proposer knows the quantity, but the responder only knows a forecast, the distribution of the resource, when the proposer knows that the quantity is low, it's about 80-20%. And when the proposer knows that the quantity is high, actually the proposer is struggling to retain the 60% of the resources. And we think there's an interesting result there because this participatory story means that even when people have a seat at the bargaining table and get punished, in the case of the ultimatum game by rejected, but in real life by protesting on the streets, etc., information asymmetries can make bargaining outcomes more unequal. So it's not only about sitting about the table and have the capacity to negotiate, it's also about having similar information. So in this particular case, our results show that equity can rise with dissemination of scientific outputs that are key, in this case, for example, for adaptation strategies. In the same context of Brazil, and in a case of unequal information, we also wanted to model unequal productivity. And how, in a context of unequal productivity, what institution has better effects on efficiency and equity. So again, we use an ultimatum game to study this bargaining situation, but we modify the ultimatum game by adding a surplus sharing step. So in the ultimatum game, classic ultimatum game with asymmetric productivity, there is a trade-off between equity and efficiency. If you are the most productive player, you want to have all the resources. So you will have here a trade-off between equity and efficiency. Here we add a surplus sharing step in which the more productive player can share some of the resources in a third step. So we don't have this trade-off between equity and efficiency. And then we sort of test the effect of different institutions. Trust, in which you request the resources and you don't tell them how much you are planning to share. Message, in which you actually send a message saying, like, I'm planning to send you this in the third step. And contract, that message is binding. And what we found there is that, of course, the trust-based institution, with or without promises, raise efficiency above the standard prediction, so there is more trust than the neoclassical prediction we'll think of. However, there is still a lot of lies. So because of the lies, in the context of unequal productivity, explicit and forced transfers actually can help equity more than trust-based institutions. This is a result that is, particularly in the context of unequal productivity. No? I'm not just claiming that contracts are always better, but in a context of unequal productivity, definitely it increases equity and efficiency, of course. We also have some work looking at irrigation systems on their scarcity, and here was also a more conceptual work, and we were asking here if people who experience scarcity increase self-image or not. And we did this in the context of an irrigation game, in which basically how an irrigation game works is that depending of your location, you have the right to extract first. So in this case, we're a group of 5 people, and they have to extract depending of the order in the canal. And our question here was that to test the sequences of scarcities. So what happens if you first face lower scarcity and then abundance, or if you face first abundance and then lower scarcity? No? If thinking about the peaks on climate, that if you're going to start facing low resources, if you're going to become more selfish or not. And we did this back in Colombia with rice producers that have actually been exposed to seasonal water scarcity. And no good news here. What we found is that facing higher scarcity actually could erode the basis for collective action. So past low resources due to external shocks increase self-image. You may think that when people are going through a bad situation will react, but what we are finding is a different story here. So let me shift now to a more good, to better news than the one that I just said, because here we were thinking about, again, designing institutions to solve a problem that is currently going on in Colombia, but in other regions of the world. And I'm talking about small-scale gold mining. And this is work with Luz Rodriguez, a former PhD student at Duke, and also with Alex Baff. For those of you who are not familiar with this issue, basically, small-scale gold mining is the principal source of mercury pollution of the world and an important driver of deforestation. This is a problem that is in his peaks right now in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and even the Amazon region. And it's a very hard to regulate problem because individual monitoring is difficult, lack of property rights, and it's very expensive. So this is what a landscape after gold mining looked like. So we thought about testing a new policy approach here. And the idea was if we can implement monitoring of aggregate outcomes to promote individual compliance, no? Instead of trying to do individual monitoring. And we did this with 840 miners in the Pacific region of Colombia. And basically, we designed a game in which group of 5 miners have to make decision about the mining intensity. So miners have to decide between having one pump, a pump, 2 pumps, 3 pumps. Of course, in real life, they will not keep buying pumps. They will just buy higher, bigger backhoes or other type of technology. But in the game, we model this with pumps. The more pumps that you have, more gold, but more environmental damage. And in this game, the state cannot observe individual but aggregate outcomes. And basically, the state introduces a rule. If the number of total pumps in the community is equal or less to a limit, let's say 10 pumps of the community or 5 pumps in the community, miners will evenly split a collective reward. So basically, this game makes it a coordination game. It's not like the prisoner dilemma game, in which it's always good to not cooperate. In this case, depending on your expectation about others, could be good to cooperate. So we can have here efficient Nash equilibria that implies compliance, or inefficient Nash equilibria that everybody chooses 3 pumps and there is no compliance. And basically, we did 2 studies here. We did a study in which we have 6 treatments in which we shift the ordering of the policy. What happens if you start with a hard limit, say no pumps in the community or 5 pumps in the community, and what happens with if you start with a soft policy, in this case 10 pumps, right? And then we also add communication to see the effect of communication. And what we found is that compared to a baseline situation, the collective incentive is effective in reducing the aggregate mining intensity. And these collective incentives could be thought about, for example, a permit to do legally mining, or a collective payment for environmental services. I mean, it could be, in reality, you can think about different collective type of rewards. So we found that compared to the baseline, the collective incentive is effective at reducing the mining intensity. However, if you start with extremely severe targets, coordination can collapse. So the policy implication here is that you find better outcomes when target initially is less severe. Because if you start with very severe targets, it's difficult to coordinate and the cooperation collapses. When then you put a soft target, then already everybody hates each other, nobody is going to comply with the regulation. Of course, we thought about, well, maybe this is because of the lack of communication. What happened if with the typical experiment, we let people communicate? And what we found here is that communication, in fact, of course, helping coordination mainly in the most challenging targets. So the added value of communication was when you introduce a severe target. However, compliance doesn't imply equal distribution of choices. There was a lot of asymmetries that decrease with communication, but it's still. What doesn't mean is that leaders, and actually we coded the responder, 15 out of 20 groups, we identified leaders that suggested choices. So again, back to a situation of inequality. So yes, trust exists, people coordinate, but there is a lot of room for inequality. So in these cases, the leaders actually dictate symmetric Nash strategy in 55% of the cases. That means saying to everybody in the group, let's all have 2 pumps, or let's all have 1 pump. But we also have 44% of cases in which leaders of the community will say, okay, I have 3 pumps and each of you 1 or you 0, so they dictate the unequal choices. So when there is room for trust, sometimes there is also room for inequality. Finally, I wanted to show you also thinking about collective incentives, also this new work that we are doing with Lina Moros and Esteve Corbera and NICTA, thinking about the effect of payment for ecosystem services on motivation crowding. So as most of you should know, programs of payment for ecosystem services are increasing. For Costa Rica, this is all news, but for example, for Colombia, just now they launched the new PES law in the country, and we are having every single day 1 program in each of the regions of Colombia. And right now, worldwide, there are like 550 active programs with an estimated of 42 billion in annual transactions. So payment for ecosystem services are still, growing worldwide. And there is an emerging concern about if intrinsic motivations are altered or are displaced by these monetary incentives. Of course, here we are assuming that some people have intrinsic motivations to start with. It's not that dichotomic situation, like either I conserve or not conserve. No, people have some intrinsic motivation to take care of the forest, and the question here, like, if I pay them, what is going to happen? So our question here is that there is a motivation crowding when payment for ecosystem services are implemented? If so, which type of motives are crowded out? and if that depends on the specific features of the PES program, the type of payment, for example. So a lot of literature have tried to address this question, but in most of the experimental work, they sort of measure behavior or assume motivation is equal to behavior. And in this work, we are trying to measure behavior and separately motivation. And ask ourselves the interaction between different types of payments and different type of motivation. And we conducted these experiments again in Colombia, in the Caquetá region, which is the Amazon Piedmont, which is the agricultural frontier, and where there are a lot of planning for PES programs there. And basically, we design and conduct a forest conservation game with farmers in this region, and we test the effect of different type of payments. Price premium, which is just like a coffee ground under forest, and you receive a price premium. Individual and collective payment on behavior and motivation. And we design a motivation survey based on the self-determination theory of social psychology, in which we try to measure different types of motivations: intrinsic, guilt, social, external, and A-motivated. And we test and see if there is an effect between the types of payments and motivations. And what we found is basically that, yes, all payments increase forest conservation. However, they have different effects on motivation. So, for example, individual and price premium PES alter the intrinsic and the guilt motivation. So they reduce intrinsic and guilt motivation. That you can think about that this is important in the long run once the payment is not in place anymore. However, again, the collective PES, just as the one I showed you with the miners, is not only effective to increase behavior, but actually crowds in social motivation. So the fact that you have a collective payment instead of an individual payment actually has an important effect on the motivation. So I think this is a new line of research that I wanted to pursue and to start thinking about how the type of payments are affecting motivations in the long run. And I think this is the type of question that it will be difficult to do it with other methodology. So just to summarize the tour that I took you to, all these experiments, we have found that conformity rather than selfishness best describes average motivation for natural resource users. We found this for fishermen, but I think it's a likely situation to find elsewhere. We found that scarcity and information asymmetries can increase selfishness. In bargaining environments, both contracts and dissemination of scientific outputs raise equity. However, we also found that effectiveness of institutions based on social norms depend on prior history and is context specific. So in the case of minors, we have found that when it's costly to observe individual choice, government could provide incentives, conditional and aggregate compliance. And these collective incentives, if of course we have to test it in different contexts, at least for farmers, we have found that crowds in farmers' motivation. So as I said, they are not necessarily all the studies connected, but there are some common lessons that we are starting to find. As I said at the beginning, I wanted to finish this presentation by talking a little bit about how we've been using this experiment as a pedagogical tool in the field. It's different when you do experiments with students in the campus than when you do these experiments in the field and you are basically to arrive to a community with a lot of cash in the middle of the jungle, it's something at least disturbing. So I think this is a good opportunity to use the pedagogical, these experiments as a pedagogical tool, because I think that participants are more than experimental subjects. So our practice always when we do these experiments in the field is to hold workshops after the experiments to actually discuss with the community the result of the experiment, like a very rapid discussion of what we found. And we have found that these experiments are actually a very useful tool to communicate and disseminate information. Just like in classroom experiments, it's very useful to explain a concept that otherwise is very abstract, that the same happen in the field. So people learn by doing, and otherwise difficult and sensitive uses, sensitive topics or abstract concepts such as cooperation, the importance of collective action, is much better to discuss it after you just leave it in the experiment. So this is one practice that we are trying to do always that is possible, and is to have these workshops after the experiment to use this as an opportunity not only to gather data, but also to try to help with the discussion in the community. I'm not saying that we are solving the problem of the community with this workshop, but at least we are opening a discussion based on the results of the experiment. And just to finish here, I think the experiments are a great opportunity within the EFD network to do cross-country studies and cross-context studies. I think that since the 2001 paper on 15 small societies in the search of the Homo economicus, there hasn't been a lot of cross-country studies using experiments, and I think that the EFD network, perhaps this is a new collaborative effort, will be a great opportunity to find either an instrument or a theme, fisheries or water or any of the other collaborative forests, and to try to replicate one protocol across centers. I think that will be a great opportunity here. We have all the human capital, a lot of experimentalists or people interested in that in different centers. So I don't know why we haven't done that. I think it's a great opportunity to do a cross-country study using the same protocol or some variations to really have a more robustness test across contexts. And with that, I think I finish. Thank you.
Wow, Maria Alejandra, this was great, a stellar performance. This is what we want to see in EFD keynotes, right? Perfect, good theory, really innovative methodologies, and real-life applications on the most important issues. And then a call out for the next step for EFD. I'm goosebumps. Okay, so do we have a runner now with a microphone? Yeah, we have a runner with a microphone, because I know that a lot of you are doing this kind of work out in various countries. So do we have some questions, comments? Yes, Brenda at the back. Who else? And Mike, of course, always Thomas, yes. And why don't we start with Erin at the back? Yes. At the back.
Thank you, Maria. So I wanted to pick up with your last slide, and this is call out for EFD to do cross-country comparative research using the same experiment. And just suggest that one reason that that's hard is that probably you want to develop your experiment so that it suits each context, right? And so that's I think, likely to be the key challenge, right, is that trade-off between standardizing an experiment across contexts versus making what seem like pretty obvious adjustments to make it suit the particular context and make it relevant to that context. So could you speak a little bit to that challenge and how you would think about approaching it?
Yeah, I think that, of course, you're right, and I just said that results are context-specific, but you can think about like a baseline that is just capturing a dilemma that we are studying across all the countries. Like, I don't know, the dilemma about fisheries is the same everywhere. Or like a key dilemma that will be the baseline, and maybe the institutions could respond to the specific context. So you can try different institutions or different interventions in each country, but then the baseline have a common interest, like a common protocol. That way you can also have like if you're worried about publication, like one paper on the baseline, and then in each country, like the twist or the variation that responds to the context. So I do think there is ways to do it, but I do think that the need in this literature is to start having, a replication across contexts to see if there is robustness in the results. So I think there is a way to solve that tension.
So, Brenda.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. That was fantastic. So my question is a little bit on the method. So some of us do much more in the field, whether that's longer term studies or. So I'm curious when in your own work or others that you've read. So the students who are reacting in classrooms are one thing, and then you are going from the classroom to sort of constructing the classroom in the village itself, right? But they're still sitting in a somewhat artificial setting, because I was looking at some of the fishermen, they're sitting in this nicer building, and then they're studying the matrix. And then if you push it one more level further, if they were really in their environment in a community meeting in the evening or something, do you see any systematic difference in how they respond in these more artificial to more natural settings?
Yeah,
In your own work, or if others you've read and done and studied?
I mean, I guess that's the eternal tension between internal versus external validity, right?
Yeah.
So the less control you have is probably more externally valid, but then you lose the internal validity. I mean, I think that's still a question.
But can you sign that bias? Do you know which way they are responding?
I mean, there are some papers that have shown, for example, I remember right now Andreas Leibrand and John Lee's paper, in which they show that people who are extracting less in the game are actually those using, in a fisheries game, a net that are smaller, no? So there is some, I don't remember the papers right now, but there is a lot of papers that have shown that actually people that behave in certain ways on the lab are able to predict that behavior in real life. So there are some work that has solved that tension. What is the size of the bias of doing that in artificial environment? Or I don't know. I think that this is interesting also, for example, if you're talking about measuring social capital, the difference between communities. Maybe one person is not, you cannot predict the behavior of that person in the lab versus in the real life, but I think that overall is capturing the behavior of the group. So, I mean, that tension is always there.
Mike Toman? Oh, but it is your turn. Okay. Good. Now we're going to have another round in a second.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, for it's here.
Where is it?
The voice should sound familiar, but I've been drinking beers last night, so my voice has changed.
Only two, though.
Yeah, well, not sure.
Sorry.
So thanks for a great presentation. I'm also a big fan of experiments, for sure. What I wanted to ask is a follow-up question to what Sobrendo suggested. This is still an artificial environment. I wanted to hear your insights on the possibility of running a randomized controlled trial in a larger scale, where you can vary some of the management structures. Of course, this is going to get bigger and complicated and extremely costly. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on the possibility of doing it, just maybe to give some ideas for upcoming PhD students to consider working on this.
Yeah, of course, RCTs probably are more exciting because are real interventions. However, as I said, I think that there are some questions in which I will say, let's try it first with a decision-making experience. For example, this question that we are studying about the unintended effects of payment for ecosystem services. Like, I don't want to do a RCT on that and then basically screw the community that now destroy the whole intrinsic motivation. So I think that with RCTs, it's better to do interventions in which you are looking for the most effective one, but that the direction is correct. So I think that for the experiments are still valuable for intervention in which you don't know the way in that the direction of the effect. So so I see that in some cases the decision-making experiment could be also used as a test bed for the RCTs. And once you are clear about the direction, assuming that you can predict behavior outside the lab, then do the RCT. But I think that the experiments are a useful tool as a test bed as well for the RCTs. Yeah.
Okay, can I have, now we will have a last round of threes. Let me see, how many hands do I have? A last round of three, but I only have 2 hands. Now I have 3 hands.
Gunnar, there's one here.
The 3 first ones. Yes, so let's start at the back. And then I'll take...
Thank you.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. What I was interested in was, at the end you were talking about the workshops that you do after you've done the experiments. And so I was interested just in general about everything you learned from that, but this is only a short time. So in particular, I was interested in, once you then explained this is why we're doing this game and this is what came out of it, what kind of feedback did you get from the participants about how they thought it related to what they would do in practice?
You want me? You want to?
No, you do one more.
You don't imagine how active and interesting those conversations are. So really, people after the game are dying to talk, to discuss, to identify who was the cheater, to identify who was the bad guy or the good guy. So, and immediately after, at the beginning they always talk about the game, and this is happening with the game, but 5 minutes afterwards they already jump to real life, always. This is like in the fishing game, and of course they always have comment about this is not how it happened, or some details. For example, I remember in the irrigation game that I show you 5 players making decisions in a ladder. And they were like, I don't live in a ladder, it's not like that, it's like that. So they're always comment this is not my case. But in general, they always capture the idea of the dilemma and immediately start talking about the real problem. So that's what I'm saying, otherwise difficult problems that they will not start talking about immediately after leaving the game. It's just more easier to make the metaphor or the parallel. So there are always comments about you could have done it better, of course, just like in any other seminar, but they immediately start talking about their real life problems. I mean, there are some people who have tried to measure the effectiveness of these workshops. Juan Camilo Cárdenas has a paper about that, and actually it shows that people learn something, hopefully the correct message after those workshops.
Thank you. Wisdom.
Okay, Maria, very interesting presentation. I've done quite a bit of work on fisheries, especially in developing countries. And I'm quite surprised that, well, maybe not surprised that the message from the Pope didn't make an impact.
Me too. I thought I was going to.
It could be because maybe the Christian God is very passionate, very forgiving. If you had gone to the fishing villages, maybe in Ghana, and then you change that to the sea god, the impact would be completely different. When some fishermen were fishing with poison and dynamite, and then nothing could stop them, the chief fisherman made them take an oath that if you do that, the sea god will punish you, you can die at sea or something like that. And then it was renewed occasionally, and no one did that for a very long time. So I think we should be careful generalizing that message from the Pope is a proxy for religion. It depends on the type of religion, and it depends on the extent to which people believe in that religion, that the God can reward or punish them. Thank you.
No, totally, I agree with you, and this is not, we decided to do it, the Pope, just because on the survey they said that it was a popular person in town, so that's why we use it, but it could also be that it was the wrong messenger. So it was me reading about the encyclica. Maybe a guy would be better just because the Catholic Church is not a woman preaching. So maybe the effect was me, not the Pope. So, but more than the Pope, we were trying to test the moral, the moral appeal, no? But I'm sure in other contexts could work, yeah.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I wanted to follow up on the question about the pedagogical tool. And first of all, a remark. You say you don't want to affect the communities, but I think you are affecting the communities by the experiments. And in particular, I'm curious to know whether you or others have explored the actual effects on behavior of doing the experiments, or on extraction behavior or whatever setting you are in after they have done the experiments, and what they have learned from that.
No, and that's a very good question of the impact on the long run of the experiments, which I haven't. That's a question by itself. And yes, I totally know that I'm affecting the community, or I don't know if at least I'm making a disturbance in the community. I don't know if in the long run they will remember me or not. But the workshop, at least, is my way to give some, discussion after the workshop. Because if you happen to be in a group in which you destroy the fishery or whatever, or in which nobody shared, you may think that's the best for the group or something. So I think that the workshop at least clarify the intention of the experiment and what I consider, or what the literature consider, like as the social optimum. Of course, like in a class, people could just walk out saying like the best strategy was to actually destroy the fisheries. But at least the workshop has the attempt to tie any of the possible answers to the experiment. But I think it's a fantastic question to see what is the long-run effect of the experiment. As I say, Juan Camilo Cárdenas have done it like to test the effect on water consumption, I think, about participating in a field experiment or in a field experiment plus the workshop to see which community actually in the long run reduce the water consumption. And I think he has a very interesting result on that. I don't know if it's published already.
Okay, thank you. It's very inspiring. Is it too loud?
No, I was just nervous that it was your question.
Okay. Very inspiring talk. I'm wondering about how you interact with policymakers, both when it comes to experimental design, when you're telling them about your results, and how they buy your results, and do they actually listen to you?
Well, it happened a little bit like with the Pope, no? Sometimes I'm not the correct, in Latin America, the correct person to interact. But yeah, I think it varies. For example, more than the policymaker, like a lot of NGOs have been very interested in this work. For example, WWF in Colombia, anytime that they have to talk about a new fisheries regulation, they used to use this experiment as a way to communicate the new regulation or the new intervention. So I have to admit that I have been more successful with NGOs that are implementing this in the region, like different programs that the policymakers, which still think that this is an abstract representation of real life and how that will inform policy. But for example, next month we're having a policy making day in Colombia about payment for ecosystem services for those officers that are right now implementing the PEST programs in Colombia, to show them a little bit of our research, but also other research to see if they can inform better their decisions. But just like in the case of the committee, you don't know. I mean, you try to inform decision-making, but who knows if they are really paying attention. But I try. I do my effort.